Imagine stepping back 2,000 years to the night of the Nativity. What do you think you'd see? A peaceful, stable, glowing softly, or a chaotic scene filled with political turmoil, packed-ins, and to everyday folks just trying to get by under Roman rule? We often think of this moment as a calm, picture-perfect scene from Christmas cards. But the truth was way more intense, raw, and relatable. Tonight, we peel back the layers of tradition to walk the dusty roads of Judea. We will smell the smoke of campfires and hear the murmur of ancient Aramaic under a vast winter sky. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden textures of history, please do take a moment to subscribe and like this video. And I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what is the hour on your clock? Settle in now, pull the covers up tight, and let the modern world fade away as we journey back in time. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we begin our journey not in Bethlehem, but in the halls of power in Rome, where a single decree sets the ancient world in motion. To understand the road to Bethlehem, we must first look to the west. Across the Mediterranean Sea lay the heart of an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt. At the center of this vast web sat one man. His name was Caesar Augustus. He was the first true emperor of Rome, a man of cold calculation and immense vision. He had ended decades of civil war to establish a new order. They called it the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. It sounded beautiful in speeches delivered in the Senate. It promised stability, law, and order. But for the provinces on the fringes of the map, this peace was enforced by the point of a sword gladius. It was a peace maintained by the rhythmic marching of ironclad legions. In the province of Judea, the air was thick with tension. It was a land of ancient traditions and fierce independence, now chafing under the heavy hand of foreign rule. The people here did not see the glory of Rome. They saw the tax collectors. They saw the soldiers. They saw the loss of their own sovereignty. Ruling over this volatile region was a client king named Herod the Great. He was a complex figure, paranoid and ruthless, yet a builder of magnificent scale. He constructed massive fortresses on high plateaus, like the impregnable Masada. He expanded the Second Temple in Jerusalem until it gleamed like a mountain of snow and gold. His architecture was meant to impress and intimidate. The white marble of Herod's palaces stood in stark contrast to the dusty, brown villages of the common people. While the king dined on imported delicacies, the people in the hills scraped a living from the rocky soil. The presence of Rome was inescapable. The eagle, the symbol of the legions, cast a long shadow over the marketplaces and synagogues. To manage this vast territory, the Romans relied on a complex system of bureaucracy. Syria was the administrative hub for the region. A man named Quirinius served as the governor there, tasked with maintaining order and, most importantly, ensuring the flow of money. Taxes were the lifeblood of the empire. They paid for the roads, the aqueducts, and the armies. But to tax a people, you must know who they are and where they live. You must count them. This was the purpose of the census. It was not a casual survey. It was a tool of domination. It was a reminder that every man, woman, and child was a subject of the emperor. For the Jewish population, this was not just an inconvenience. It was a spiritual affront. They believed they belonged only to their God, not to a man in a distant city. The language of the land reflected this fractured identity. In the streets, you would hear Aramaic, the common tongue of the people. It was the language of the home and the field. In the marketplaces, you might hear the sharp, quick cadence of Greek, the language of commerce and trade. And in the courts of law, the heavy, authoritative sounds of Latin would echo off the stone walls. Connecting it all were the roads. The Romans were master engineers. They carved straight lines through forests and deserts. They paved the earth with stones so durable that some remain today. These roads allowed the legions to move quickly to crush rebellions, but they also allowed ideas to travel. They allowed people to move, and soon, two specific people would have to step onto one of these roads. From the grand scope of the empire, we zoom in to a tiny, insignificant village in the hills of Galilee. Its name was Nazareth. If you were to look for it on a Roman map of the time, you might not find it. It was a hamlet, a cluster of homes clinging to a hillside. Nazareth was home to perhaps 200 or 400 souls. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else. There were no secrets here. The houses were simple structures. Many were built directly into the limestone caves that honeycombed the hills. They were expanded with walls of rough fieldstone and mortar. Life here was lived in the open courtyards. The women would gather to grind grain into flour using heavy stone mills. They would spin wool from their flocks, the coarse fibers passing through their fingers as they chatted in the sun. The smell of baking barley bread would waft from the communal ovens, a warm and earthy scent that signaled the end of a long day. In this village lived a man named Joseph. Tradition often paints him as an old carpenter, gently sanding wood in a quiet shop. But the historical reality was likely quite different. The Greek word used to describe his profession is tekton. This implies more than just a woodworker. It means a builder, an artisan, a man who works with hard materials. In a landscape dominated by rock, Joseph likely worked with stone as much as timber. He was a man of strength and precision. His hands would have been calloused and rough, stained with the dust of limestone. He may have walked daily to the nearby city of Sepphoris. This major city was under heavy construction at the time. It was a bustling urban center just an hour's walk away, yet a world apart from humble Nazareth. Joseph was betrothed to a young woman named Mary, or Miriam in her native tongue. In this culture, she was likely a young teenager, which was typical for the time. Betrothal was far more serious than a modern engagement. It was a legal contract. They were considered married in the eyes of the community, even though they did not yet live under the same roof. This period, known as kiddushin, usually lasted for a year. It was a time of preparation. Joseph would have been building a room onto his family's home to welcome his new bride. Mary would have been preparing her dowry and learning the skills of running a household. But this predictable rhythm of life was shattered. Mary was found to be with child. In a tight-knit honor and shame culture, this was a scandal of immense proportions. Whispers would have followed her at the village well. The well was the heart of the village, the only source of water. It was where the women gathered each morning and evening with their clay jars. To walk there and feel the eyes of the neighbors required a quiet, steely courage. We can imagine the atmosphere in Nazareth, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light entering the small, high windows of their homes. The rough sensation of sleeping on woven reed mats spread over packed dirt floors. It was a life of simplicity and hardship. The diet consisted of what could be grown or traded: barley bread, olives, lentils, and perhaps fish on special occasions. This quiet village life is suddenly interrupted by the arrival of the imperial decree. A herald, or perhaps a town elder, brings the news to the village square. Caesar Augustus has ordered a census. The entire world is to be registered. For Joseph, this command presents a significant problem. The Roman census often required men to return to their ancestral towns to register. It was a way to reinforce the clan structures that the Romans used for administration. Joseph was of the house of David, his lineage traced back to the great warrior king of old. And the city of David was Bethlehem. Bethlehem was not close. It was in the region of Judea, far to the south. The journey would cover approximately 80 or 90 miles. In a world without cars or trains, this was a massive undertaking. It meant leaving behind their livelihood. A Tecton does not get paid if he is not building. A farmer cannot tend his crops if he is on the road. The timing could not have been worse. It was likely late in the year. The harvest would have been finished, but the winter rains were approaching. The roads would be muddy and cold. And for Mary, the timing was physically dangerous. She was heavily pregnant, nearing her time of delivery. Yet, to disobey a Roman decree was to invite severe punishment. There was no real choice. The village of Nazareth would have erupted into frantic energy. Families began packing their belongings. They had to carry everything they would need for the journey. There were no hotels or convenience stores along the way. They would pack dried figs and dates, high-energy foods that would not spoil. They would fill wineskins with water and perhaps some cheap wine to mix with it. They would carry small flasks of olive oil used for cooking, for lighting lamps, and for soothing sore muscles. We can hear the groan of wooden cartwheels being tested. We can hear the braying of donkeys. A donkey was a valuable animal, a tractor of the ancient world. Not every family owned one. It is likely that Joseph, being a skilled tradesman, could afford one, or perhaps borrow one for his pregnant wife. But for many, the journey would be made entirely on foot. The preparation involved a heavy emotional toll. There was the silence of locking a home, unsure of when the return would be. Would their tools be safe? Would their neighbors watch over their property? There was the fear of the open road. The spaces between towns were wild and lawless. Bandits, known as lesti, preyed on travelers. They watched the trade routes, looking for small, vulnerable groups. For this reason, nobody traveled alone if they could help it. They formed caravans. Friends, relatives, and neighbors would band together. There was safety in numbers. The journey became a communal event, a migration of families moving south. With meager supplies packed into bundles and strapped to their backs, or their beast of burden, they stepped onto the open road. They left the familiar hills of Galilee behind, beginning the trek south. The air was crisp and biting. The wind carried the scent of impending rain. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem offered two main routes. The first was the ridge route. This path went straight through the heart of Samaria. It was the most direct line, cutting through the central highlands. However, it was fraught with danger. The Samaritans and the Jews held a deep, historical animosity toward one another. Violence between travelers and locals was not uncommon. Because of this, many Jewish pilgrims chose the second option. This was the route through the Jordan River Valley. It was longer, adding days to the trip, but it bypassed the hostile territory of Samaria. It is very likely that Joseph, protective of his wife and unborn child, chose this longer, safer path. This route required them to descend from the hills of Galilee down into the Rift Valley. The topography changed dramatically. They would leave the cool, olive-studded hills and descend to below sea level. The air would grow thicker and warmer as they approached the river. The days fell into a rhythm of walking, step after step, on the hard-packed earth. For a woman in the late stages of pregnancy, every mile must have been an ordeal. The jarring motion of a donkey is not comfortable. Walking is exhausting. Her feet would have swollen. Her back would have ached. Joseph would have been constantly vigilant, watching the horizon for threats, watching Mary for signs of distress. They would have had to cross the Jordan River, likely at one of the shallow fords. We can imagine the sound of the water rushing over smooth stones. The cool water would have been a relief to tired feet. But river crossings were also choke points, places where thieves might lie in wait. The nights were a different challenge. They slept in the open, or perhaps in the courtyards of caravanseries, if they could find space. They would huddle around campfires, wrapped in their cloaks against the desert chill. The sky above Judea is vast and incredibly dark. The stars would have shone with a brilliance we rarely see today. But the darkness also held fear. Lions and bears still roamed the wilderness of Judea in the 1st century. The travelers would keep a fire burning all night. They would take turns keeping watch. The sounds of the night, the howl of a jackal, or the rustle of dry brush would have kept their senses sharp. After days of travel along the flat river valley, they would reach Jericho. This ancient city was known as the City of Palms. It was a lush oasis, green and fragrant, fed by natural springs. It was the last major stop before the final leg of the journey. But the hardest part was yet to come. From Jericho, the road turned west and began a steep, brutal ascent toward Jerusalem. This stretch of road was infamous. It rose over 3,000 feet in a short distance. It wound through barren limestone canyons. It was known as the Ascent of Edom, or the Ascent of Blood, named for the red tinge of the rocks, or perhaps the blood shed by victims of bandits. The air would grow thinner and colder as they climbed. The smell of the desert dust would be replaced by the scent of pine and damp earth as they reached the highlands. The vegetation changed from palm trees to scrub brush and hardy oaks. It was a test of endurance. We can picture Joseph, his face coated in road dust, urging the donkey forward. He pushes against the steep grade, his legs burning. Mary holds on, her body weary, feeling the child move within her. They are just two faces in a stream of travelers, all weary, all obeying the command of a distant emperor. Finally, after a week of travel, they would crest the final ridge. The landscape would open up before them. In the distance, the lights of a town flickered in the twilight. It was not the grand metropolis of Rome. It was not the busy port of Caesarea. It was a small, ancient town perched on a hill. It was Bethlehem, the house of bread. As our travelers pause to rest by the roadside, gazing at their destination, I am reminded that history is full of such incredible journeys. People have walked across continents, sailed unknown seas, and crossed frozen wastelands. Are there other ancient travels or famous historical expeditions you would like me to cover in a future story? Perhaps the Silk Road or the voyages of the Polynesians? Let me know in the comments below, and we might take that path together next time. Their arrival in Bethlehem was not the end of their struggle. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. The town was overflowing. The census had done its work. The descendants of David had returned from all corners of the land. The narrow streets were clogged with people and animals. The noise would have been overwhelming after the quiet of the open road. Donkeys brayed, merchants shouted, and families argued over space. The air smelled of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and animal dung. It was chaotic. It was kinetic. It was real. Joseph would have begun the desperate search for a place to stay. He was looking for a guest room, a place where his wife could rest and give birth in dignity. But door after door remained shut. The inns were full. The guest rooms of relatives were packed to capacity. The desperation must have mounted with every rejection. The sun was setting. The temperature was dropping. And the labor pains were beginning. They were strangers in their own ancestral home, crowded out by the very history that brought them there. But they were resilient. They were people of the land, used to making do with what they had. They did not need a palace. They did not need a feather bed. They just needed a shelter, a place out of the wind, a place where a new life could begin. And so they found themselves pushed to the margins, not in a cozy wooden stable, as we often see in paintings, but likely in the lower level of a house or a cave used to stable animals. It was here, among the livestock, that their journey paused. The reality of that night was gritty. It was textured. It was not a silent night, but a night filled with the sounds of a town bursting at the seams. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, something profound was about to happen. The empire of Rome went on with its business. The legions marched. The taxes were collected. Augustus sat on his throne. But in the dark corner of a small village, the world was about to change. The road to the city of David had been long and hard. It had tested their strength and their resolve, but they had arrived. As the stars wheeled overhead, Joseph and Mary settled into the straw, waiting for the dawn of a new day. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the limestone hills of Judea in shades of violet and bruised orange, when Joseph and Mary finally stood before the gates of Bethlehem. This was Bethlehem Ephrata, a name that echoed through the centuries of Jewish history. It was the city where the shepherd boy David was anointed king. It was a place of deep ancestral pride. But on this particular evening, it was not a monument to the past. It was a chaotic, breathing struggle for the present. The town was bursting at the seams. The census decree had done its work too well. Thousands of people, all tracing their lineage back to the house of David, had descended upon this small hilltop community. The population had swollen to double, perhaps triple, its normal size. As our weary travelers stepped through the gate, they were met not with a welcoming silence, but with a wall of sound. It was a cacophony that assaulted the senses. There was the shouting of merchants trying to sell the last of their bread or lentils to hungry arrivals. There was the bleating of sheep and the braying of donkeys, animals that were jostling for space in the narrow, winding alleys. There were the cries of tired children and the loud, animated arguments of men bargaining for sleeping space. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, the musk of livestock, and the smoke of hundreds of cooking fires roasting meat. Bethlehem was built into the limestone ridges of the hill country. The architecture was solid and enduring, a maze of stone houses clustered together, often sharing walls. The streets were narrow, designed to provide shade in the summer and windbreaks in the winter. But now they felt claustrophobic. You would have to press your back against the rough stone of a wall just to let a loaded camel or a cart squeeze by. The infrastructure of the town was groaning under the weight of the influx. Water was the most critical resource in this arid land. The town relied on cisterns, great underground chambers carved into the rock to catch the winter rains. With so many thirsty mouths, both human and animal, the water levels would be dropping dangerously low. We can imagine the tension at the public wells, the anxious glances of the locals as they saw their reserves being drained by strangers. Order was maintained by the flash of iron. Roman patrols would have been navigating the crowds, their presence a constant, silent threat. The soldiers were there to ensure the census was completed and the taxes were logged, but they were also there to suppress any spark of rebellion. A gathering of so many Jewish men from the royal line of David was politically dangerous. The soldiers watched with cold, calculating eyes, their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. For Joseph, the immediate crisis was shelter. He was moving through the crowd, guiding the donkey that carried his wife, his eyes scanning every face. He was looking for a cousin, an uncle, anyone from his extended clan who might offer a bed. The census was, in many ways, a massive family reunion. Distant relatives who had not seen each other in years were suddenly thrown together. But this reunion was fraught with desperation. The concept of hospitality in the ancient Near East was not just a polite social norm. It was a sacred duty. To turn away a relative, especially one with a pregnant wife, was a source of deep shame. It was a violation of the honor code that held society together. And yet, the reality of the physical space could not be ignored. This brings us to one of the most persistent misunderstandings in the Christmas story. We are often told that Joseph and Mary were turned away from an inn by a heartless innkeeper. We picture a motel with a no vacancy sign, but the Greek word used in the historical text is katalima. This word does not mean a commercial hotel. It translates far more accurately to guest room or upper room. In a typical Judean home of that era, the guest room was the upper chamber where visitors would stay. Joseph was likely knocking on the doors of his own relatives, asking for the use of this guest room, but the answer at every door was the same. The katalima was full. The guest rooms were already packed with other elders, other cousins, other travelers who had arrived days earlier. We can imagine the stress etched onto Joseph's face. The sky was turning black. The wind was picking up, biting through their cloaks. Mary was in the early stages of labor. The rhythmic contractions were beginning to seize her body. To be on the street in such a condition was terrifying. The sheer volume of rejection must have been crushing. Every shake of a head, every closing door, added to the weight on his shoulders. The flicker of thousands of oil lamps began to illuminate the stone walls of the city, casting long, dancing shadows. The noise showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it grew louder as people settled in for the evening meal. Joseph and Mary were adrift in a sea of people, surrounded by their own kin, yet utterly alone. Finally, a solution was offered. It was not a rejection, but an act of desperate hospitality. If the upper guest room was full, there was only one place left. It was the lower room. It was the heart of the house, the place where the daily work was done, and where the animals were brought in for the night. To understand where the nativity actually took place, we must deconstruct the image of the wooden barn standing alone in a snowy field. The reality of a first-century Bethlehem house was far more organic and integrated. These homes were often built directly in front of, or on top of, natural caves. The limestone landscape was honeycombed with these caverns, and the people used them to their advantage. The typical house was a split-level structure. The upper level, or the raised platform, was the living area for the family. This is where they slept, ate, and entertained guests in the Catalima. But down a few steps, on the lower level, was the area for the livestock. This lower room was not a place of filth, but a place of value. Animals were precious commodities. A family's donkey, their few sheep, perhaps a cow or a goat, were their tractors, their wool factories, and their milk sources. You did not leave them out in the open field at night, where thieves or wolves could get them. You brought them inside. This lower area was often a cave that extended into the hillside at the back of the house. The floor was not paved with marble or wood. It was packed dirt or raw stone. It would have been covered in straw and hay to absorb the waste of the animals. It was here, in this earthy, working space, that Joseph and Mary found their shelter. In many ways, this setting offered advantages that the crowded guest room upstairs could not. The guest room would have been packed with sleeping bodies, noisy with snoring and conversation. There would have been zero privacy. But the stable area, the lower room, offered a strange kind of seclusion. It was quiet, save for the shuffling of the livestock. There was also the matter of heat. A stone cave can be bitterly cold in the winter, but the presence of large animals acts as a natural furnace. The body heat of a donkey and a cow can raise the temperature of a small, enclosed space significantly. In a night that likely dipped near freezing, the warmth of these beasts was a mercy. The environment was undeniably gritty. We must engage our senses to fully grasp it. The air would have smelled pungent. It was the scent of damp hay, of animal musk, of the earth itself. It was not the scent of incense or perfume. It was the smell of life in its most basic form. The lighting was minimal. Joseph would have likely lit a simple clay oil lamp. These were small, handheld vessels filled with olive oil, with a floating wick made of flax. The flame would have been small, casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back the shadows only a few feet. It created a sphere of intimacy in the darkness of the cave. It is highly probable that they were not entirely alone in terms of assistance. While men were strictly excluded from the birthing process in this culture, the women of the household, or perhaps a local midwife, would have likely come down to help. The laws of hospitality would demand that a woman in labor be assisted. But in the narrative of the night, the focus narrows down to the couple. Mary would have been settled into a corner, perhaps on a pile of fresh hay covered with blankets. The rough texture of the cold limestone walls would have been at her back. The gentle, rhythmic chewing sound of the animals would have been the background noise to her labor. The donkey she had ridden might have been standing just a few feet away, its breath steaming in the cool air. This was the setting. Not a pristine, sanitized stage, but a room filled with the tools of farming and the smell of beasts. It was a place of survival. And it was here, in the lower room, that the moment arrived. The process of birth in the ancient world was a dangerous and terrifying event. There were no monitors, no sterile fields, no anesthetics. It was a battle between life and death. For Mary, a young woman, likely in her mid-teens, this was her first child. The fear must have been palpable. The physical toll of the 90-mile walk would have compounded her exhaustion. Her muscles were already weary from the road, and now they were called upon to perform the most strenuous task of all. As the night deepened, the noise of the city outside began to fade. The shouting of the markets died down. The families in the upper rooms drifted into sleep. The silence of the Judean hills began to press in against the stone walls of the house. The world became very small, just the circle of lamplight, the breathing of the animals, and the labored breathing of the mother. When the child finally came, the first sound to break the hush was the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. It is the universal signal of life, a sound that brings an immediate, visceral flood of relief. The baby was alive. The mother was alive. In the ancient world, that simple fact was a victory. The first actions taken were steeped in tradition and necessity. The baby would have been washed, perhaps with water from a jar that Joseph had warmed. Then, following the custom of the land, the child was likely rubbed with salt. This was an ancient practice, believed to have antiseptic properties and to toughen the skin. It was a ritual of preservation. Then came the wrapping. Mary took strips of cloth, known as swaddling clothes. These were not just a blanket draped loosely. They were long bands of fabric wrapped tightly around the infant's body, binding the arms and legs straight. This was done to ensure the limbs grew strong and straight, but also to give the child a sensation of pressure and security, mimicking the safety of the womb. And then the problem of where to lay him. There was no cradle. There was no furniture in this animal room. And so Mary looked to the most practical object available, carved into the stone floor, or perhaps hewn from a separate block of limestone, was a manger. The Greek word fatni means a feeding trough. It was not a wooden box filled with soft down bamboo. It was a cold, hard stone basin where the donkey and the sheep ate their fodder. Mary likely filled it with fresh, soft hay to create a cushion. She lowered her newborn son into this feeding trough. The contrast is staggering when we pause to think about it. Here was a child who would be called a king, a figure who would shape the course of history, and his first throne was a place where animals ate. It is a detail that has captivated storytellers for 2,000 years because it is so incredibly humble. It grounds the story in the dirt and the dust of reality. The temperature in the cave would have been cool, but the swaddling cloths and the hay would have kept the infant warm. The steam rising from the warm breath of the animals would have been visible in the dim light. Joseph, who had likely been waiting on the periphery, perhaps stepping out during the birth itself, would have now drawn close. We can see the look on his face, the anxiety of the journey, the fear of the census, the shame of the rejection at the doors. All of it would have melted away in this moment. He was looking at a new life. He was looking at his son. The exhaustion on Mary's face would have been absolute. She had walked from Nazareth. She had endured the rejection of the town. She had given birth on a stone floor. But there is a specific kind of peace that follows the pain of childbirth. A holy hush settled over the room. The animals settled back into their rest. The lamp burned low, while the town of Bethlehem slept, unaware of what had transpired in the lower room of one of its houses. The world outside the walls was still active. Out in the open country, in the dark fields that surrounded the town, there were others who were awake. These were the shepherds. In the social hierarchy of the first century, shepherds were near the bottom. They were often viewed with suspicion. Their work kept them away from the town and the synagogue for weeks at a time, making them ritually unclean in the eyes of the strict religious leaders. They were rough men, living under the open sky, smelling of sheep and campfires. They were keeping watch over their flocks by night. This detail tells us something about the season. If the sheep were out in the fields at night, it suggests that it might not have been the depth of winter, or perhaps these were a specific kind of sheep. Tradition holds that the flocks around Bethlehem, near a place called Migdal Eder, or the Tower of the Flock, were destined for the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. These were not just any sheep, they were holy vessels. And so, the men who watched them were guardians of a sacred trust, even if society looked down on them. The night was dark. The Judean wilderness is pitch black when the moon is down. The only light came from the small, crackling fires the shepherds built to ward off the chill and scare away predators. We can hear the snap of dry thorns burning, the low murmur of their voices as they told stories to pass the long hours. The sheep would be a sea of sleeping wool around them. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered. The narrative describes an encounter with an angel, but it describes it in terms of terror. The glory of the Lord shone around them. This was not a soft, candlelight glow. It was a blinding, overwhelming brilliance. It was a rip in the fabric of the night. The reaction of the shepherds was instant and visceral. They were sore afraid. This is a deep, trembling terror. In the ancient world, to see the divine was often thought to mean death. They fell to the ground, shielding their eyes. The voice that spoke to them cut through the fear. Fear not. It is the standard opening for almost every angelic encounter in history. It is a command to calm the racing heart. The message that followed was specific. It was news of great joy. A Savior had been born. But the sign, the proof, was the most shocking part of the message. They were told they would find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. This was the key. A baby in swaddling clothes was common. Every baby was swaddled. But a baby in a feeding trough, that was unique. That was a signature that could not be missed. It was a sign that spoke directly to them. Men who worked with mangers and animals every day. When the light faded and the night rushed back in, the shepherds did not hesitate. The text says they went with haste. They didn't debate. They didn't wait for morning. They left their flocks, perhaps leaving one or two behind to guard, or perhaps trusting the divine protection of the night. They ran. We can hear the sound of their sandals slapping against the rocks. We can hear their heavy breathing as they scrambled up the steep terraces toward the town. They were unwashed, rough men running toward a king. They burst into the town of Bethlehem, likely asking, searching, looking for the house where the lower room was occupied. And finally, they found it. They ducked their heads to enter the low doorway of the stable cave. Imagine the scene from the inside. The quiet intimacy of the family is suddenly interrupted by a group of breathless, wild-looking men from the fields. They brought with them the smell of the outdoors, the scent of sage, dirt, and wet wool. They crowded into the small space, their eyes wide with wonder. They saw exactly what they had been told. The stone manger, the swaddled child, the tired parents. The contrast was absolute. The glory of the angels in the field, and the humble, earthy reality of the stable. They told Joseph and Mary what they had seen. They spoke of the light, the voice, the choir that had filled the sky. Mary, listening to these strangers, did not speak much. The history tells us she kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. She was gathering the fragments of this impossible night, storing them away in her memory. The shepherds eventually left, returning to their fields, glorifying God. Their loud voices would have faded into the distance. The family was left alone once more. The lamp flickered out. The night finally claimed its rest. The road to Bethlehem had ended. The chaos of the census had been navigated, and in the quiet of a cave, amidst the sleeping animals, The history of the world had pivoted on a single, silent axis. As we picture this scene, the image of that first night is often associated with gathering and warmth. We think of family, of food, of coming together against the cold. As we pause here in the narrative, I am curious, what is your own favorite tradition for this time of year? Is it a specific meal you cook, a song you listen to, or perhaps just the quiet of a winter's evening watching the snow fall? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. Now, as the family sleeps and the stars wheel overhead, the night passes, but the story is not over. For the birth of this child has set in motion forces that are already moving in the darkness. Far to the east, eyes are watching the sky. And in the palace of Jerusalem, a jealous king is about to wake up. The night of the birth had passed. The shepherds had returned to their fields, their excitement fading into the quiet rhythm of their work. The angels were gone. The star that had watched over the town continued its slow march across the heavens. For the town of Bethlehem, life began to return to normal. The census crowds were still there, but the urgent, frantic energy of arrival had settled into a routine of waiting. For the new family, however, the journey was only just beginning. The first few days were likely spent in the quiet recovery of the mother. They remained in the humble shelter where the child was born, shielded from the wind and the prying eyes of the world. But the customs of their people, the ancient laws of Moses, marked the time with precision. On the 8th day, the silence was broken by ritual. It was the day of the Brit Milah, in accordance with the covenant made with Abraham centuries before the child was circumcised. It was a mark of identity, a physical sign that he belonged to the people of Israel. It was also on this day that he was officially given his name. He was not named after his father, Joseph, as might have been expected. He was named Yeshua, or, as we know it in English, Jesus. It was a common name, meaning God saves, yet it carried a weight that few in the room could have understood. Time continued to turn. The days became weeks. The family likely moved from the stable area into a more permanent arrangement. Perhaps a small rented room or a space within a relative's house as the census crowds began to thin. The law required another journey, a pilgrimage to the heart of the Jewish world. According to the book of Leviticus, a woman who gave birth to a son was considered ceremonially unclean for 40 days. At the end of this period, she was to present herself at the temple for purification. And so, when the 40 days were completed, Joseph and Mary wrapped their son against the winter chill and set out for Jerusalem. The journey from Bethlehem to Jerusalem is not long, perhaps 6 miles. But the emotional distance between the humble village and the holy city was vast. As they crested the hills, the Temple Mount would have dominated the horizon. Herod the Great was a tyrant, but he was a master builder. He had expanded the Second Temple until it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Massive stones, some weighing hundreds of tons, formed the retaining walls. The sanctuary itself was covered in plates of gold that reflected the sun with such brilliance that it was painful to look at. To a simple craftsman and a peasant girl from Galilee, the scale of it must have been overwhelming. They were walking into the center of their universe. They entered the city gates and made their way up to the temple courts. The air here was different. It was filled with the smoke of the altar, the smell of burning cedar and incense, and the copper scent of blood from the sacrifices. It was a place of noise. The sound of thousands of pilgrims, the chanting of priests, and the cooing of birds filled the colonnades. Joseph and Mary were poor. The law allowed for a sliding scale of sacrifice. A wealthy family would bring a lamb. But for those of limited means, the law accepted a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. We can picture Joseph purchasing these small gray birds from a vendor in the court of the Gentiles, counting out his few coins. It is a stark detail. The King of Kings was redeemed with the offering of the poor as they moved through the courts. Navigating the bustle of the crowds, a figure emerged from the throng. He was an old man, his face lined with the years of a long life. His name was Simeon. History tells us he was a righteous man, a man who had spent his life waiting. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, a hope that God would finally act to save his people. He had been promised by the Spirit that he would not see death before he saw the Messiah. As he saw the young couple with their infant, something sparked within him. He did not see a peasant baby. He saw the fulfillment of a lifetime of prayer. We can imagine the scene, the frail, trembling hands of the old man reaching out to take the child from Mary. The contrast between the chaotic noise of the temple crowds and this intimate bubble of silence is profound. Simeon held the child and looked up toward heaven. He spoke words that have been sung in cathedrals and monasteries for 2 millennia, known as the Nunc Dimittis. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace. He was ready to die, for he had seen the light. But his words also carried a shadow. He looked at Mary, the young mother, and his voice dropped to a solemn whisper. He spoke of the child being a sign that would be spoken against. And then he delivered a chilling prophecy directly to her. A sword shall pierce your own soul also. It was a jarring note in the melody of the birth narrative. The joy of the new life was suddenly tempered by the promise of future sorrow. In the midst of the gold and the grandeur of Herod's temple, the cross was already casting a shadow. They also met Anna, an elderly prophetess who lived within the temple complex, fasting and praying night and day. She too recognized the child, speaking of him to all who looked for redemption. These 2 figures, Simeon and Anna, represented the faithful remnant of Israel, the old guard passing the torch to the new. When the rituals were done and the birds offered, the family did not return immediately to Galilee as one might expect. Instead, they returned to Bethlehem. The town was quieter now. They settled into a house. Joseph likely found work in the area, perhaps using his skills as a tectan to repair the homes damaged by the census crowds. They lived there for some time, perhaps a year, or even 2. The baby grew into a toddler. He learned to walk on the stone floors. He learned to speak his first words of Aramaic. It was during this period of relative calm that the horizon darkened once more. Strangers were coming. We must peel back the layers of myth that surround these visitors. We often call them the 3 kings. We picture them riding camels, wearing paper crowns, arriving on the night of the birth. But the history is quite different. The text calls them magi, or magoi in Greek. They were not kings. They were likely members of a priestly caste from the east, probably from the Parthian Empire, which controlled Persia and Babylon. These men were scholars, astronomers, and perhaps followers of the ancient teachings of Zoroaster or Daniel. They studied the night sky with obsessive precision, believing that the movements of the stars dictated the rise and fall of empires. They had seen a phenomenon, a star that signaled the birth of a new king of the Jews. They traveled a vast distance, likely over 1,000 miles. They would have crossed the harsh deserts of Arabia or followed the trade routes along the Euphrates River. They did not arrive on the night of the birth. By the time they reached Judea, Jesus was a young child living in a house. Their arrival in Jerusalem caused a stir. Imagine a caravan of Parthian nobles riding into the Roman-controlled city. They wore trousers and tunics, distinct from the robes of the Jews and Romans. They wore tall, felt caps. They spoke a foreign tongue, requiring translators, and they asked a question that was politically explosive. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? King Herod was still on the throne. He was an old man now, consumed by illness and paranoia. He had killed his own wife. He had executed 3 of his own sons because he suspected them of plotting against him. The Roman Emperor Augustus once joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. When Herod heard of these strangers asking for a new king, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. To Herod, this was not a spiritual event. It was a threat to his power. He summoned the chief priests and scribes, demanding to know where the Messiah was to be born. They opened the scrolls of the prophet Micah. The answer was clear. Bethlehem. Herod, masking his murderous intent with a smile, called the Magi to him secretly. He asked them exactly when the star had appeared. He told them to go to Bethlehem, find the child, and return to tell him, so that he too could worship him. It was a lie, born of pure malice. The Magi left the palace and followed the guidance of the star south to Bethlehem. When they arrived at the house where Joseph and Mary were living, the scene must have been surreal. These wealthy, exotic scholars from the East entered the humble home of a carpenter. They saw the young child with Mary. The text says they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures. The gifts they brought were not random. They were laden with symbolism that the early church fathers would later dwell upon, but which also had practical value. Gold, the metal of kings. It was a tribute to royalty. Frankincense, a rare and expensive resin from Arabia used in the incense of the temple. It was a symbol of deity, of prayer rising to God. And myrrh. This was the most jarring gift. Myrrh was an aromatic resin used in perfume, but primarily it was used in embalming. It was a spice for the dead. Even in his childhood, the shadow of mortality was present. The house would have been filled with the strange, heady scents of these foreign spices. The glitter of gold coins or vessels would have shone in the lamplight, a fortune for a poor family. But the visit was short. That night, the Magi received a warning in a dream. They were told not to return to Herod. Being men who understood the language of dreams and signs, they obeyed. They left Bethlehem quietly, bypassing Jerusalem, and returned to their own country by another route. Herod waited. As the days passed and the Magi did not return, his anxiety turned to a cold, burning fury. He realized he had been tricked. His reaction was swift and horrific. He did not know which child was the king, so he decided to eliminate them all. He issued an order to his soldiers. They were to go to Bethlehem and the surrounding districts and kill all the male children who were 2 years old or under, based on the timeline he had learned from the Magi. This event is known as the Massacre of the Innocents. While historical records outside the Bible do not mention this specific event, it fits perfectly with the known character of Herod. However, we must be careful with the scale. Bethlehem was a small village. The number of boys under the age of 2 would likely have been between 10 and 20. This does not lessen the tragedy. The grief of those mothers was absolute, but it was a localized atrocity, not a national genocide. But before the soldiers' boots could echo on the cobblestones of Bethlehem, the family was gone. Joseph had been warned in a dream, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt." The departure was urgent. We can imagine the hushed packing in the middle of the night. Joseph would have gathered their few belongings. The gold brought by the Magi likely became their lifeline, funding their escape and their life in exile. They saddled the donkey and slipped out of the town under the cover of darkness. They headed south, then west, likely joining the Via Maris, the way of the sea. This was the ancient coastal road that connected the empires of the Nile and the Euphrates. They were becoming refugees. They were fleeing the wrath of a government, seeking asylum in a foreign land. The journey to Egypt was long and arduous. They had to cross the Sinai Desert. We can visualize the vast, empty silence of the dunes. The only sound was the wind hissing over the sand and the steady plodding of the donkey. The stars that had guided the Magi now watched over the fleeing family. Egypt was a natural place of refuge. There was a large Jewish community in Alexandria, but it was a strange land. They would have seen the great pyramids, already ancient and weathering in the sun. They would have seen the temples to animal-headed gods. They heard a language they did not speak. They lived there as strangers, waiting. They were waiting for news from home, waiting for the tyrant to die. Finally, in the year 04 BC, the news came: Herod the Great was dead. The monster who had cast such a long shadow over the land had finally succumbed to disease. The angel appeared to Joseph again in a dream, telling him it was safe to return, for those who sought the child's life are dead. The family packed up once more. They began the long trek back across the sands, back toward the promised land. But as they approached Judea, Joseph heard troubling news. Herod's son, Archelaus, was ruling in his father's place. Archelaus was known to be just as violent and unstable as his father. Fear gripped Joseph. To return to Bethlehem, so close to Jerusalem and the seat of power, was too dangerous. He needed to go further north, to the fringes of the political map. He needed to go home to Galilee. They bypassed the dangerous region of Judea and made the long climb back into the hills of the north. Finally, they saw the familiar ridge. They saw the olive groves and the small cluster of houses. They were back in Nazareth. The relief must have been physical. To be back among people who spoke their dialect. To be back in a place where the Roman presence was lighter. To be home. And here, the narrative shifts. The high drama of angels, stars, kings, and assassins fades away. It is replaced by the profound silence of the ordinary. The family settled back into the routine of village life. Joseph unpacked his tools. The sound of the hammer and the saw began to ring out again from his workshop. He returned to his trade as a tecton, building homes, repairing plows, perhaps walking the hour to Sepphoris to find work on the great projects there. Jesus grew up. He was no longer the baby in the manger, nor the toddler with the gold of the Magi. He became a boy of Nazareth. The historical record falls silent here, a period often called the hidden years. For nearly 30 years, there is almost no mention of him, save for one incident in the temple when he was 12. We must understand the beauty of this silence. The creator of the universe spent decades doing chores. He would have walked to the well to fetch water for his mother. He would have learned to shape wood and stone with his father. He would have had calloused hands and sawdust in his hair. He learned the Torah. He sat in the small synagogue of Nazareth on the Sabbath, listening to the Chazan, read the scrolls. He learned the rhythm of the Jewish year, the Passover, the Feast of Booths, the Day of Atonement. He lived a life so completely normal, so utterly indistinguishable from his neighbors, that years later, when he began his ministry, the people of his own town would ask in shock, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" The landscape of Galilee is different from the harsh stone of Judea. It is greener. In the spring, the hills are covered in wildflowers, red anemones and yellow mustard blooms. The wind rustles through the olive trees with a soft, shushing sound. It is a peaceful place. We can imagine the family sitting together in the cool of the evening, the sun dipping below the distant Mediterranean, casting a golden light over the village. They eat their bread and olives. They talk about the day's work, the extraordinary events of the birth, the angels, the star, the fear of Herod, slowly become memories, woven into the fabric of their family history, held in the quiet of Mary's heart. The threat was over. The journey was done. The child was safe. And the world continued to turn, unaware that in a small, dusty shop in Galilee, the pivot point of history was learning to hold a hammer. And so, the dust settles on the road to Bethlehem. The shouts of the census crowds fade into the wind. The Magi vanish back into the east, and a family finds quiet in the hills of Galilee. The event that would split history in two ends, not with a thunderclap, but with the soft, rhythmic days of ordinary life. As we leave Mary and Joseph in the peace of Nazareth, I invite you to take a deep breath, letting the tension of the journey release from your shoulders. We have walked the road together, and now we rest. If you are drifting off, let the story go. But if you wish to linger a little longer, we will now light the historian's candle to examine the mysteries left behind. The narrative has reached its resting place. The figures of the shepherds have faded back into the hills, and the Magi have returned to their distant lands by another road. The cry of the child in the manger has softened into the rhythmic breathing of sleep. Now, as the dust settles on the road to Bethlehem, we find ourselves in a different kind of quiet. It is the quiet of the scholar's study, a room lined with ancient scrolls and lit by a single steady candle. Here, away from the wind and the noise of the crowded inn, we can look back at the story through the lens of history. We can examine the puzzles that have intrigued minds for 2,000 years. This is not a place for conflict or argument. It is a place for gentle curiosity, where we trace the edges of time and look at the delicate machinery of the past. We begin with the puzzle of time itself. The calendar on the wall tells us the year, but the true date of these events is a mystery wrapped in the mists of antiquity. The rustle of ancient parchment scrolls whispers of a discrepancy that historians have pondered for centuries. We look to the Gospel of Matthew, which places the birth during the reign of Herod the Great. This king, a builder of temples and a figure of immense power, casts a long shadow over the history of Judea. Yet, we know from the Jewish historian Josephus and from the precise astronomical calculations of lunar eclipses that Herod died in the year we now call for BC. This places a definitive anchor in the timeline. For the story to hold true to Matthew, the child must have been born before the spring of that year. But then we turn the page to the Gospel of Luke. Here, the narrative is tied to the census of Quirinius, the governor of Syria. The Roman records, meticulous and bureaucratic, tell us that Quirinius did not take his post until the year 6 AD, 10 years after the death of Herod. We are left with a gap of a decade, a silent chasm in the historical record. How do we reconcile these two markers? Scholars have spent lifetimes harmonizing these threads. Some suggest that Quirinius served an earlier term, a time of corrigency lost to the fragmentary nature of surviving texts. Others propose that the census was a long, drawn-out process, begun under one ruler and completed under another. We imagine the slow turning of the wheel of history, where decrees from Rome took years to travel to the dusty provinces of the East. The ticking of time in the ancient world was not measured in uniform seconds, but in the reigns of emperors and the cycles of the moon. The year 1, the starting point of our modern era, was not established until centuries later. It was a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, working by candlelight in a stone cell in the 6th century, who attempted to calculate the date. He was a humble man, as his chosen name, Exiguus, or the Little, suggests. In his quiet dedication, he sought to create a calendar based on the birth of Jesus, moving away from the years of the Emperor Diocletian. But in his complex charts of ancient chronologies, in the flickering light of his cell, he likely made a small error. He did not account for the 4 years of Augustus acting as Octavian, or perhaps he simply miscalculated the death of Herod. And so, most historians suggest a date between 6 BC and 4 BC. It is a strange paradox that the figure who defined the era was likely born before Christ. But this does not detract from the story. It merely adds a layer of human texture to the divine narrative. It reminds us that history is recorded by human hands, prone to the gentle slips of memory and mathematics. We also look to the season. The image of snow falling softly on the stable roof is a beautiful one, born of northern European winters. But the text tells us of shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. In the hill country of Judea, the winters are cold and wet. The flocks are brought into the folds when the rains begin in late autumn. The presence of the shepherds under the open sky suggests a time of milder weather. Perhaps it was the spring, during the lambing season, when the nights are cool but bearable. Or perhaps it was the early autumn, before the winter rains set in. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the 2nd century, noted that various groups proposed dates in May or April. The date of December 25th does not appear in the Bible. It was chosen later, a symbolic placement to align the birth of the light with the turning of the solar year. It represents the spiritual truth of a new dawn, rather than a literal mark on a calendar. From the calendar on the desk, we look up to the heavens. The ceiling of our study opens up to reveal the inky blackness of the ancient night sky. It is a sky free from the light pollution of the modern world, a vast dome of velvet pierced by the sharp diamond brilliance of the stars. The Star of Bethlehem is perhaps the most captivating mystery of the entire Nativity account. For centuries, astronomers have trained their telescopes and their calculations on this celestial beacon. Was it a miracle? Was it a myth? Or was it a rare and spectacular alignment of the natural world? In the early 17th century, the great astronomer Johannes Kepler observed a rare conjunction of planets. He watched, fascinated, as Jupiter and Saturn drew close together in the night sky. In his meticulous way, he calculated back through the centuries and found that a similar, even more significant event occurred in the year 7 BC. In this year, Jupiter and Saturn met not once, but 3 times in a triple conjunction. To the ancient Magi, who were astrologers as much as they were astronomers, this would have been a message written in fire across the firmament. Jupiter was the king planet. Saturn was often associated with the Jewish people, or the protector of Israel. And this meeting took place in the constellation of Pisces, which was also linked to the lands of the East and the end of times, a king of the Jews in the land of Judea. The symbolism was a language they understood perfectly. Imagine the Magi standing on their ziggurats in Babylon or Persia, charting the positions on papyrus maps. They watch the slow, majestic movement of the planets across the ecliptic. They see the wandering stars, as planets were called, engaging in a cosmic dance. They note the phenomenon of retrograde motion. As the Earth orbits the Sun faster than the outer planets, there are times when a planet appears to slow down, stop, and move backward against the background stars. To an observer on Earth, it can look as if a star is hovering, standing still over a specific location. Other theories whisper of comets. The Chinese chronicles of the Han Dynasty, known for their precise observation of the heavens, record a broom star appearing around the year 5 BC. Comets were often seen as omens of change, sweeping away the old to make way for the new. The shimmer of a comet's tail, hanging like a sword or a scepter in the pre-dawn sky, would have commanded attention. Or perhaps it was a supernova, the explosive death of a star in a distant galaxy, creating a new, brilliant point of light that flared suddenly in the darkness and then faded over months. In the ancient world, there was no hard line between astronomy and astrology. The movements of the heavens were the clockwork of the divine. The silence of the cosmos was heavy with meaning. A scholar named Michael Molnar recently proposed a theory based on Roman coins from Antioch. These coins depicted the sign of Aries looking back at a star. He suggests that the star was not a visual spectacle, but a regal horoscope, a powerful alignment in Aries that signified the birth of a divine king in Judea. It was an event hidden in the glare of the sun, known only to those who knew the mathematical secrets of the sky. Whether a conjunction, a comet, or a calculation, the image of the star persists. It remains a guiding light in the imagination, a symbol of the quest for truth and the journey through the night. While the stars remain constant, the way we celebrate has changed, flowing like a river through the landscape of history. We turn our attention now to the festive atmosphere that surrounds the season. Long before the Nativity story took root in the West, the month of December was a time of celebration. In the heart of Rome, the festival of Saturnalia reigned from December 17th to the 23rd. It was a time of inversion and release. The social order was turned upside down. Masters served their slaves at the banquet table. Gifts were exchanged, often small candles or clay figurines. The streets echoed with the shout of Io Saturnalia, a cry of joy that pierced the chill of the winter air. It was a riotous, boisterous affirmation of life in the face of the dying year. Following Saturnalia came the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, established by the Emperor Aurelian. This celebration was held on December 25th. It marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. This was the turning point. The sun, having reached its lowest point on the horizon, began its slow climb back towards the north. It was the return of the light, the promise that the darkness would not triumph. In the dense forests of the Germanic north, the festival of Yule celebrated the same cosmic rhythm. The Yule log was dragged in from the snow-covered woods, a massive trunk that would burn for 12 days. Its flames were a sympathetic magic, a way to call back the warmth of the sun. As Christianity spread across the empire, it did not erase these traditions. Instead, it absorbed them. It baptized the calendar. The logic was poetic and profound. If the pagan world celebrated the return of the physical sun on December 25th, how fitting it was to celebrate the birth of the spiritual light, the light of the world, on the same day. The Church Fathers understood the power of existing rhythms. They grafted the new story onto the old roots. The greenery that decked the halls of Saturnalia, the evergreen boughs that symbolized life amidst the death of winter, remained. They became the holly and the ivy. The candles that were lit to call back the sun became the candles of the Advent, symbolizing hope and prayer. We can almost smell the scent of pine boughs brought indoors, the sharp, resinous aroma filling the room. We can feel the warmth of the hearth fire, contrasting with the frost on the window pane. We taste the spiced wine, a tradition that goes back to the Roman wassail bowls. The feasting, too, had a practical root. In an agricultural society, the onset of winter was the time when livestock was slaughtered, as there was not enough fodder to keep them all through the cold months. This meant that fresh meat was available in abundance. The darkest time of the year became the time of the greatest plenty. The blend of these traditions is seamless. The joy of the Roman street party merged with the solemnity of the Mass, creating a holiday that is both raucous and reverent, a celebration of the body and the spirit. The visual heart of this celebration, the manger scene itself, has its own history of evolution. We might assume that the nativity scene, or cachet, has always been central to the observance, but this is not so. In the early centuries of the Church, art focused on the majesty of the Magi. The three kings, in their exotic robes, were depicted presenting their gifts. It was an image of power, acknowledging power. The humble manger was often in the background, a mere detail. It was a man named Francis, from the town of Assisi, who changed the way we picture the event. In the year 1223, Francis was concerned that the story was becoming too theological, too distant from the hearts of the common people. He wanted to make the poverty and the humility of the birth tangible. And so, in a cave near the town of Grittier, he staged the first living nativity. Imagine the rough texture of St. Francis's wool habit as he arranged the scene. He did not use statues. He brought in living animals. He led an ox and an ass into the small stone grotto. Interestingly, the ox and the ass are not mentioned in the gospel accounts of the birth. Their presence comes from a verse in the book of Isaiah, which says, "The ox knows its master, the donkey his owner's manger." Francis brought this prophecy to life. He wanted the people to smell the straw and hear the breathing of the beasts. He wanted them to feel the cold of the night. Mass was celebrated over the manger, which served as the altar. The story goes that a local soldier saw a vision of a sleeping child in the manger, who woke when Francis embraced him. This moment shifted the focus of the holiday from the high theology of the Incarnation to the tender humanity of the baby. From that cave in Italy, the tradition spread like wildfire. The Renaissance artists took up the theme. Botticelli and Da Vinci painted the adoration with a new grace. They added golden light, ruinous architectural backgrounds, and idealized landscapes. The scene became glamorous, a tableau of perfection, but the core remained. The simple wooden figures carved by peasants in the Alps, the elaborate ceramic sets of Naples, the santones of Provence. Each culture made the scene their own. Music solidified the mythos. The carols we hum in the quiet of the evening served as oral history. Silent Night, written by a parish priest in Austria, captured the stillness of the event. We Three Kings canonized the number of the Magi, though the Bible never says there were three, only that there were three gifts. In the Victorian era, the holiday underwent another transformation. Charles Dickens, with his tale of Scrooge, emphasized the themes of charity and family. Prince Albert, the German husband of Queen Victoria, brought the Tannenbaum, the Christmas tree, into the royal palace. An engraving of the royal family standing around a decorated tree was published in the London Illustrated News, and suddenly, every home in England and America wanted a tree. The commercialization began to creep in, but beneath the tinsel and the trappings, the power of the crochet remains. It is a stillness of a wooden figurine set on a mantel. It is a focal point for reflection. And now, we come to the enduring resonance of this story. Why does it persist? Why, after 2,000 years, does the world still pause? The history book closes gently, but the themes remain open. The story persists because it speaks to a universal human condition. It is a narrative of birth and new beginnings. Every parent who has held a newborn knows the feeling of awe and terrifying fragility that the story captures. It is a story of hope in the darkness. Just as the solstice marks the return of the sun, the birth narrative marks the return of hope in a weary world. It is a story of the inversion of power. We are used to stories where the hero is strong, wealthy, and born in a palace. Here, the king is in a trough, vulnerable and dependent. The first announcement is made not to the high priests or the governors, but to shepherds, the marginalized workers of the night. It tells us that significance is not found in status. It is a story of the family unit as a central pillar of survival. It is a refugee narrative of a family forced to flee a tyrant and find safety in a foreign land. It is a story of generosity, of the Magi who give without expecting a return. But perhaps, most of all, it is a connection to childhood wonder. It connects us to a time when the world was magical, when lights twinkled with promise, and when peace seemed possible. The phrase "peace on earth" is a longing that never fades. As we sit in our historian's study, the facts and dates and astronomical charts fade into the background. They are important, for they anchor the story in reality, but they are not the heart of the matter. The visual of a single candle in a window remains. The sound of a lullaby drifts from a distant room. The warmth of a family gathering, or the quiet solitude of a peaceful mind, settles over us. The peace of a sleeping world is the final gift of the story. The dates may be debated, the stars analyzed, and the traditions traced back to ancient roots, but the core of the story remains untouched. It is a pause in the middle of winter, a moment to light a lamp against the dark and remember the value of humble beginnings. As the scholarly questions fade into the quiet of the night, we are left with a simple sense of peace. The mind can rest now. The learning is done. We have traveled a long way together, following the path of history through dates and names, through conflicts and resolutions. But now, the journey of the mind is over. The dates have dissolved into the mist. The names of kings and emperors have been etched into stone and left behind in the desert. We have arrived at a place where time moves differently. This is the eternal now of the ancient world. It is a place of deep, resonant stillness, where the only clock is the movement of the sun across the sky and the lengthening of shadows on the ground. Here, in the 1st century, the world is raw and immediate. It is a world of textures, of scents, and of sounds that have existed since the dawn of humanity. Let us step out of the stream of history and simply exist in this landscape. Let us walk slowly, with heavy, relaxed steps, through the sensory world of Judea. There is no destination. There is only the experience of being here, safe, warm, and surrounded by the simple, enduring rhythms of life. We begin by closing our eyes and listening. The soundscape of the hills is a tapestry woven from silence and subtle movements. The most constant presence is the wind. It is not a harsh wind, but a steady, breathing current that flows down from the high ridges and moves through the valleys. We can hear it passing through the olive groves. The olive trees, with their gnarled, ancient trunks, stand like sentinels on the terraced slopes. As the wind moves through them, the leaves turn. They are green on one side and silver on the other, and the sound they make is a dry, soft rustling, like the whispering of 1,000 quiet voices. It is a sound that rises and falls, a gentle wave of noise that washes over the hills and then recedes, leaving peace in its wake. Below the wind, we hear the sounds of life. In the distance, there is the bleating of sheep and goats. It is a sporadic, earthy sound. The flocks are moving slowly across the rocky pasture, their hooves clicking against the limestone. Occasionally, we hear the deeper, resonant sound of a wooden bell tied around the neck of a led ram. It clunks rhythmically with every step, a dull, hollow tok-tok that marks the slow procession of the herd. A shepherd calls out, a sharp whistle, or a melodic cry in Aramaic, a language of guttural warmth and soft vowels. The voice carries far in the thin, clear air, echoing off the canyon walls before fading into the vastness. If it were the rainy season, the soundscape would change. We would hear the drumming of water on the flat stone roofs of the village houses. It is a chaotic, percussive rhythm, a washing away of the dust. The water runs in rivulets down the stone walls, splashing into the muddy streets. But now, let us imagine the dry season, where the silence is profound. In the heat of the day, even the birds are quiet. But in the early morning or the cool of the evening, the air is filled with the cooing of doves. They nest in the clefts of the rocks and in the rafters of the simple homes. Their call is a soft morning sound, a repetitive lullaby that seems to say, peace, 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 peace. Sparrows chirp in the dusty courtyards, darting after fallen grain. High above, a lark sings a complex, trilling melody as it climbs the unseen currents of the air. In the village itself, the sounds are human and rhythmic. We hear the grinding of the millstone. It is the heartbeat of the morning. Two women sit on the ground, turning the heavy upper stone over the stationary lower stone. The sound is a low, continuous rumble, a grinding of basalt on basalt, crushing the wheat into flour. It is a hypnotic, circular sound, going round and round, measuring out the daily bread. We hear the rhythmic she of a broom made of twigs, sweeping a stone floor, clearing away the dust of the day. We hear the sound of footsteps on gravel, the crunch of leather sandals on the dry earth. There is no mechanical noise here, no engines, no humming of electricity, no ringing of phones. There is only the sound of wood on stone, of water poured from a clay jar, of wind in the grass. The silence of the desert at night is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, velvet silence, a presence that wraps around the world and holds it close. Occasionally, the call of a chauffeur, a ram's horn, might echo from a distant ridge, a long piercing wail that signals the end of a watch or the beginning of a feast vibrating in the chest before the silence rushes back in to fill the void. From the sounds of the open air, we move into the shelter of the home. We step across the threshold and into the warmth of the hearth. The air here is thick and rich with the scent of nourishment. The kitchen is not a separate room but the heart of the living space, centered around the fire. We can smell the wood smoke, the sharp, acrid scent of burning olive wood, or the sweeter smell of dried vine trimmings. The fire is low, a bed of glowing orange coals that radiates a steady, comforting heat. The smell of baking bread dominates the room. The flatbreads are baking on hot stones or stuck to the sides of the clay oven, the taboon. We can smell the yeast, the warm, nutty aroma of the toasted flour. It is the most primal of smells, the scent of survival and home. Nearby, there is the smell of olive oil. In this world, oil is liquid gold. It is used for light, for cooking, for healing. It has a green, peppery scent when it is fresh, mellowing into a golden richness. We can hear the oil sizzling in a pan, a gentle popping sound as vegetables are added. A clay pot sits in the embers, stewing slowly. Inside, lentils are softening, breaking down into a thick, hearty porridge. They are seasoned with cumin and coriander, spices that traveled on camel caravans from the distant east to reach this hearth. The scent of cumin is earthy and warm, mixing with the sharp, herbal fragrance of za'atar, wild thyme, and oregano gathered from the hillsides. Perhaps there is fish roasting over the coals, freshwater fish from the lake in the north, the skin crisping and turning black, the white flesh steaming. The smell is savory and salty, promising sustenance. On a low wooden table, there are bowls of produce. We see the deep, ruby red of a pomegranate that has been cracked open. The seeds glisten like jewels, tart and sweet. There are dried figs, sticky and brown, packed with sugar. There is a jar of honey, thick and amber-colored, smelling of wildflowers. A jug of wine sits ready to be mixed with water. The wine is dark, almost purple, with the scent of fermented grapes and earth. It is not just a drink. It is a symbol of joy and harvest. The act of eating is slow and communal. There is no rushing. The family sits on mats around the central bowl. They dip the warm, torn bread into the stew, scooping up the lentils. They share the fish. They pass the cup. The warmth of the food spreads through the body, relaxing the muscles, calming the mind. The heat of the taboon oven radiates outward, chasing away the chill of the stone walls. It is a cozy, enclosed world, a sanctuary of flavors and warmth against the vast, cool night outside. The meal ends, but the warmth remains, settling into the bones, a heavy, drowsy contentment that signals the end of labor. As the meal is finished and the fire burns down to embers, we become aware of the textures that surround us. The world of the first century is a tactile world. Everything has a weight, a grain, a surface. We feel the clothing against our skin. The tunic is made of wool, spun by hand and woven on a vertical loom. It is not the silky smooth fabric of modern machines. It has a texture, a slight scratchiness that speaks of the sheep it came from. It is thick and durable, holding the body's heat. On special days, there might be linen, flax woven into a smoother, cooler fabric that breathes in the heat, feeling like cool water against the skin. We reach out and touch the water jug. It is made of porous clay, fired in a local kiln. The water inside seeps slowly through the pores, evaporating on the surface to keep the contents cool. The clay is damp to the touch, cool and slightly rough, smelling of wet earth. We run our hand along the wall of the house. It is made of limestone blocks, hewn from the bedrock of Judea. The stone is hard and unyielding, yet it feels secure. It is cool in the summer and holds the warmth of the day during the winter night. The surface is uneven, pitted by time and weather, solid and grounding. There are tools resting in the corner. A carpenter's plane, the wood handle polished smooth by years of sweat and grip. We can feel the grain of the olive wood, dense and oily, warm to the touch. There are baskets woven from reeds or palm fronds. The weave is tight and intricate, the dried leaves rustling slightly when touched. The floor is covered with mats woven from rushes. They are springy underfoot, having a sweet, dry scent like hay. We look at our feet. The sandals are made of leather, stiff at first but worn smooth by the friction of walking. The leather straps have softened with oil and use, molding to the shape of the foot. We wrap a heavy woolen cloak around our shoulders. It is a garment of survival, used as a coat by day and a blanket by night. It is heavy, pressing down with a comforting weight, shielding us from the drafts. A small oil lamp sits on a niche in the wall. It is a Herodian lamp, a small clay vessel with a spout for the wick. The flame flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The light is not steady like a bulb. It is alive, moving, breathing. It reveals the texture of the room in shifting relief, the roughness of the stone, the smoothness of the wood, the weave of the mats. Everything in this room has been made by human hands. There is a connection in every object, a sense of purpose and care. The solidity of the stone threshold under the door speaks of permanence. This is a place that stands against the wind, a place of shelter and substance. The day finally ends, and the night takes full possession of the world. We step out one last time, or perhaps we look through the small, high window to gaze at the ancient night sky. It is a sky that we can scarcely imagine today. There is no light pollution, no orange glow on the horizon from distant cities, no streetlights, no headlights. The darkness of the earth is absolute, a deep, impenetrable black that swallows the hills and the trees. Because the earth is so dark, the heavens are blindingly bright. The sky is not a flat canvas. It is a deep, three-dimensional dome. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge. It is a solid band of pearlescent light, a river of milk flowing from one horizon to the other. It looks like clouds of light, dense and knotted with stars. We can see the depth of it, the layers of stars behind stars, stretching into infinity. The constellations hang heavy and low. We see the Great Bear, the guide for travelers. We see Orion, the giant, striding across the southern sky, his belt of 3 stars burning with blue-white intensity. We see the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, a tight cluster of diamond chips glittering in the void. The moon is the primary source of light. Its phases mark the passing of the months. When it is full, it bathes the limestone hills in a ghostly silver luminescence, casting sharp black shadows. When it is new, the darkness is total, and the stars reign supreme. We see the planets, the wandering stars, moving along the ecliptic. Jupiter, bright and steady. Venus, the morning star, heralding the dawn. Mars, the red wanderer. The air is so still and clear that the stars do not just twinkle, they burn. They seem close enough to touch. Standing under this sky, we feel a sense of vastness that is both humbling and comforting. We are small, but we are part of a great, rhythmic clockwork. The celestial sphere turns slowly, majestically, wheeling overhead. The silence of the sky is heavy. It is a silence that has weight. Occasionally, a meteor streaks across the darkness, a silent scratch of fire that vanishes as quickly as it appeared. This is the sky that Abraham saw. This is the sky that the shepherds watched. It is a roof of infinite wonder, a reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond the edge of the world. The feeling of floating under this dome is hypnotic. The eyes lose focus, drifting from star to star, lost in the sheer number of lights, until the eyelids grow heavy with the weight of the spectacle. And so, we return to the rhythm of rest. The village is asleep. The doors are shut. The heavy wooden bars are slid into place, locking the world out. The safety of the home is absolute. Inside, the family prepares for sleep. In the 1st century, sleep is a communal act. There are no separate bedrooms. The family sleeps together on raised platforms or on the mats spread on the floor. There is a profound sense of safety in this proximity. The breathing of others, the warmth of bodies, the shared presence creates a cocoon of security. The lamp is extinguished. The flame dips, flickers, and vanishes. For a moment, the wick glows red, sending a final wisp of scented smoke into the air. And then there is darkness. It is a true darkness, a thick, comforting velvet that presses against the eyes. There is no ambient light to distract the mind. The visual world has ceased to exist. All that remains is the sound of breathing, slow, rhythmic, deep. It is the sound of the body repairing itself, the sound of life at rest. The silence of the street outside is complete. The work is done. The grinding of the mill has stopped. The animals are silent in their folds. The wind has died down. The thoughts of the day, the labor, the worry, the plans begin to dissolve. They drift away like smoke. In this darkness, dreams come easily. They are the vivid, symbolic dreams of the ancient mind. The cool night air drifts in through the small window, bringing with it the scent of dew and cooling earth. It washes over the sleepers, fresh and clean. The body sinks into the mats. The muscles, tired from the physical labor of the day, unknot and relax. The heavy woolen blankets provide a weight that anchors the sleeper to the earth. There is a feeling of sinking, of drifting down into a deep, warm ocean of unconsciousness. The anticipation of the sunrise is there, but it is far away. For now, there is only the night, the long, undisturbed, restorative night. The mind slows down, matching the rhythm of the breathing, in and out, in and out. The boundaries of the self blur. The sleeper becomes part of the darkness, part of the silence, part of the peace. The village of the past is silent now. The lamps are out, the fires are embers, and the stars watch over the stone hills of Judea. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to travel. The road is finished, the story is told. The history books are closed and placed on the shelf. The scroll is rolled up and tied with a leather thong. The ink is dry. Thank you for walking this road with me. Thank you for listening to the echoes of the past. Thank you for being part of our sleeping scribe community. It is a privilege to tell these stories, to light a candle in the hallways of history and watch the shadows dance. But now the candle must be blown out. The scribe must lay down his pen. The paper must rest. I wish you a night as peaceful as those ancient hills, where the wind whispers through the olives and the stars wheel in their eternal courses. I wish you a rest as deep as history itself, a sleep that restores the soul and heals the spirit. Drift away now, Let the sounds of the first century fade into the quiet of your own room. Let the warmth of the ancient hearth become the warmth of your own bed. Let the stars of Judea watch over your sleep. Good night, travelers. Good night.